Good evening and welcome to the Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. My name is Grant McComb and it is my pleasure to be introducing Gloria McCoy this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
I am delighted to be here.
So, it looks like we have a lot to talk about. You have a lot of adventures on your resume here, and I think we should dive into Pyongyang first.
Okay.
How does that sound? And then work our way backwards and then go from there.
Perfect.
So, as a runner, there are a lot of marathons to run in the world. What brought you to North Korea?
I was celebrating my 70th birthday, and I wanted to, because I was moving into a new age division for competition, I wanted to do an international marathon. I decided, in looking around at marathons, it was a great opportunity to go to Pyongyang, North Korea, because it was the third year they were allowing international runners to participate. And at the time, of course, the State Department was warning it was not safe to travel to North Korea as an American citizen. So it was a little bit of a challenge that it was something I was not supposed to do, but I was allowed to do it because they were allowing international runners. And I also appreciated that there may not be another opportunity to be able to go to North Korea. And I went to North Korea and ran.
So let's start. How many other runners were there? How many other international runners were there?
There were 1,500 runners total, so it was a rather small race because I just ran the rock and roll half marathon in San Diego last weekend, and we had 25,000 runners. So,
wow.
So it was a smaller number of runners compared to a lot of the big marathons here in the United States. And of the 1,500 runners, about I would say half and half. Half were North Korean and half were international runners.
Any other Americans that weren't supposed to be there?
We could be there. We could be there because that's how we got there, because we registered to run and could work out the visas.
Yeah. How many other American runners were there?
That's a really good question. I don't know exactly how many American runners, but my guess would be, based on the group I was with and a couple of other groups there, I would say there were probably about 200 runners from the U.S.
Oh, wow. That's great. Bigger turnout than I would have expected for North Korea.
Yes.
Interesting. Now, I'm assuming it was a little bit more difficult to run in this marathon than, let's say, the rock and roll marathon that you just mentioned. Aside from the registration, what were the other hoops you had to jump through to get there?
The hoops really were arranging to get the visa, and I worked with a travel agency in Beijing, and they made all of the arrangements for the visa and the arrangements for the flight from Beijing into North Korea, and they made the arrangements for our runners' numbers. So they did all of the work behind the scenes for the race for me.
Gotcha. And what did that visa look like? What was the time frame? Was it like race specific and then you have to get out? What was the timeline on that?
The time limit for the run was you had to be finished by 4.5 hours. And if you didn't finish the run in 4.5 hours, then you were picked up and taken to the end of the race, to the finish line.
Interesting. Jeez. Did somebody say shot? You get shot in the audience? You got an audience full of comedians here.
Yeah.
What a fantastic opportunity to see a country that is historically been pretty off limits for most of the world. Was there anything that stood out to you when you first arrived?
When I first arrived, I was surprised to see how clean the streets were. The medians were planted with flowers, absolutely no litter. It was absolutely spotlessly clean. As a visitor, as a guest in their country, I was surprised that everything was so well maintained. And I have to add the footnote that I'm sure it took a lot of preparation for them to welcome foreign runners into their country. It was planned. They wanted us to see what they wanted us to see when we came to visit and to run.
Yeah, it strikes me as a landmark political event for North Korea to open their borders to so many
Yes.
foreign runners. And aside from the American runners, what were the demographics like for the rest of the running group that wasn't North Korean?
The demographics were international from all over. And the thing that impressed me most was that there were so many young runners. I was there to celebrate my 70th birthday in 2016. And the runners that I met and I spoke with from all over the world, so many were young. And I said, how do you, and this was just a marathon or half marathon that was on their agenda for a number of other races that year. They were going from one race to another all over the world. And I said, how do you afford to travel constantly just to run in these races? And what I learned was that they have blogs. And on their blogs, they write about their travels and about their running, and then they have sponsors. After so many hits on their blogs, these companies want to sponsor these runners, and that finances their travel and their running.
Marathon influencers. Marathon online influencer. What a job.
Yeah, right.
What a job. That's fantastic. So while you were in North Korea, where did you stay? What were the accommodations like? And I'm sure you were given a list of do's and don'ts. And what did that look like?
Absolutely. As soon as we arrived in Pyongyang, we met our guides. We had a female guide who was around 25 and then a male who was about in his mid-40s. And we were immediately told that we would always be with a guide. We would never be alone without a guide, except to sleep at night. And we thought probably our room was bugged. I think we were watched when we were in our room as well. We were told that we could not wear any clothing that had country symbols, that we could not have clothing that had any kind of logos on the clothing. And basically, we would always be with the guide, and that was the guideline for our travel. It was interesting because we were in a hotel that was on an island, so our bus had to cross the bridge to get to the island, and the hotel was a 47-story hotel, very modern in the lobby, and the rooms were adequate, and accommodated about 1,000 guests.
Oh, wow.
And
it's a big hotel.
It was, and we had a large dining room, so we all had our meals in the dining room. I can't recommend the food. I took some supplemental food like granola bars and protein powder and things like that. So I had some backup for the food there, and the elevators were very slow, and because of the number of people there for the race, it was a long waiting for the elevators. And one morning I was standing with a group waiting for the elevators, and I thought, this is, I can 6 flights, I can just go take the stairs and hop on down with the stairs. Well, about that time the elevator came, fortunately. So when I arrived in the dining room and went up and said good morning to the male guide, I said something about the elevators. We were kind of delayed because it took a while to get down with the elevators. And I said, I almost decided I was just going to take the stairs. Well, his mouth dropped open, and he looked at me with big eyes and said, "You do not take the elevators." So fortunately, I did not take the elevators. And you may remember the story of the Virginia student, Otto Weimer.
Yes.
He was visiting North Korea. He took a poster down, and he was imprisoned. And when he was finally released and returned to the States, he had severe brain damage and died shortly after returning to the States.
Yeah, I remember that story. It's a tragedy.
It was a tragedy, yes.
Yeah.
But you do what they tell you to. You stay where they tell you to, and that's what you do in North Korea.
So aside from the stairs, were there any other close calls where you thought, "Ooh, well,
No,
glad I didn't do that"?
No, that was the only one that I was really glad I waited for the elevator, and it came in time.
Now, you mentioned that this hotel was on an island, and you drove across a bridge in a bus to get there. Do you think that was an aesthetic choice, like, oh, there's a beautiful island, or was that a security choice? Like, I don't want all these runners wandering off into the rest of the country.
I think it was a security. I think it was a security, and we were told that we could not independently go out and do running outside of the hotel.
Interesting.
So we were not allowed to do that. And typically before a race, you want to go out and you want to do a light run and just sort of warm up. But we were not allowed to leave the hotel and go outside to do any running.
Interesting. It's surprising because it's a marathon. You want to warm up. You want to stay in tip-top shape.
Right.
I guess the guides didn't want to run with you, I suppose.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the food was not to your taste. What were they serving? What kind of food were they providing?
A lot of rice and a lot of steamed fish. And breakfast was generally things like some kind of oatmeal, and some fruit, but not particularly ripe fruit and fresh fruit. So the food was limited. It was fruit.
That's great. When you were with your guide, was it generally the same guide, or did they swap out? And did you get to know your guide? Did you chat and?
Yes, we did get to know our guides, and we were with the same two guides the entire time we were there. And the conversation that I had with the female, I asked her if she was married, and she said no. And I said, would you like to be married? And she said yes. And I said, well, what do you look for in a husband? And she said, someone who is smart and someone who is attractive. And that's about all that she would say. But there was not a lot of open conversation. It was very guarded.
That was my next question. Did it feel guarded? Did it feel like the facade was up? And
Yes.
were there any moments where you felt like you were breaking through in conversation and then the guard went back up?
Yes, yes. For example, like I just said, she was looking for someone who was smart and attractive, but that was about all that she would say.
Interesting. And did they eat with you? And
Yes, they did.
and I'm getting specific into the eating, but I'm curious, did everyone eat at the same time? Was it regimented to the
Yes.
point where everyone had to be down and eat, and then everyone goes back up? And
Yes, and that's why I was explaining to our guide, we were delayed a little bit with the elevators when his mouth dropped open and said, you don't take the elevators.
don't take the stairs, yeah. Interesting.
I mean, the stairs, yes, right.
That's interesting. And so aside from the running itself, aside from the marathon itself, you saw some sights. I'm sure they took you and
Yes.
showed you some monuments. Talk to me about those monuments.
One of the sites that impressed me most was their subway system. We were allowed to go to a subway system station. We could not ride on the subway. And to get to the station, we took an escalator 360 feet below the street. So when you think about that, and why is it so low, why is it so far below? It's a bunker. It's a bunker for them. If in times of war they need a bunker, it's the subway system. And it's also interesting that there were no facilities for the handicapped. They don't allow wheelchair. I mean, people who are handicapped don't have access to the subway system. And when we arrived after 360 feet on an escalator, it was a beautiful, beautiful station. There were chandeliers along the entire area for the train stop, and beautiful chandeliers. It looked sort of like fireworks. And on the wall there were these beautiful murals. Of course, propaganda murals were on the wall. And estimate is that there are about 500,000 riders on that system per day, because there are no cars except for the high political figures, high political leaders. And that's how people that's what they use for transportation. And to ride the subway, it is 1/2 of the US cent. So it's very inexpensive. And it was built by the Russians, of course, and the subway cars are German, but the Russians were responsible for building the subway system. I think in about 1965, they established their subways, or they started working on their subway system.
Now, is this a photograph here of the subway system?
Yes, it is.
So these are the firework-esque chandeliers.
You can get an idea of the chandeliers.
No, it looks like a beautiful station.
It's beautiful and clean.
And the mural on the back, is it all of the generations of the leaders?
They have those murals, but they also have the murals of the workers.
Ah, I see.
And the workers are divided into classifications. So they have the farm workers, they have the engineer workers, and they have the medical or science workers. So that's the way they divide their workforce. So these murals depict the different workers, a category of workers in North Korea.
Interesting. And did they touch on, did your guides tell you how they classify everyone, how they sort people into the different positions?
That's done by the leadership.
I'm sure.
That's done by Kim and the Kim dynasty.
Yeah.
And in preparing to go to North Korea, I wanted to understand a little bit about their history and how the dynasty came to be. And what I learned was that the Japanese occupied North Korea from 1910 until 1945, after the war. And during that time, during the war, the Japanese recruited 450,000 Koreans for their soldier force, and 200,000 women for what they called their comfort sex slaves for the Japanese army.
Yeah.
So you can appreciate that the people had really felt used and abused by the Japanese. And so they were looking for leadership. They were looking for leadership after the war. And after the war, Korea was divided. So the communists aligned with North Korea, and America aligned with South Korea. And at that time, they established a demilitarization zone. And to this day, the United States still maintains that zone and pays billions of dollars, and we have about 28,000 U.S. soldiers in that demilitarized zone, along with the soldiers in North Korea and in South Korea. And then after the country was divided after World War II, and the communists were aligned with North and America with the South, there was conflict because they wanted to have control with one country. So Kim was leading the campaign, if you will, in North Korea. And at that time, he became a very important figure to the people, because he was leading the fight to control all of Korea, North and South. And that resulted in the Korean War, which started in 1950 through 1953. And it was a war that ended not with a peace treaty, but with a stalemate, really, without any direction except to have the demilitarized zone. So with his leadership during the Korean War, it was, again, he was a figurehead for the people, and after the war, the first in the dynasty was Kim Il-sung, and he declared himself the leader of the country, the wisdom of the country, and the people were to be subjected to his leadership. So that's how it came about, through the wars and the division and the conflict with North and South Korea. And so he became the voice for all of the people. And it's interesting that for people who have been able to escape North Korea, which is very difficult to do, the consequences are probably that their family left behind will be executed. So
isn't there a generational punishment system?
Mm-hmm. So that's a very strong deterrent to keep the people from leaving North Korea. So it's a very strong system. It's very threatening to the people, and until they were freed from communism, when that happened in 1991, and of course they were liberated along with other communist countries, their supply chain stopped because they didn't have the communist supply chain that they had had before. And then in 1996, after liberation in 91, they had a severe drought. And a year later, they had a severe flooding. And as a result of that, they had no food supply. And so it's estimated that over 3 million North Koreans died from malnutrition because of that sequence of events.
Tragic.
It's tragic. It's really tragic, yes.
And you did all this research prior to going to North Korea?
I did, because I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand why the Kim dynasty came to be and why they are so important. And you mentioned how when we arrived, we were cautioned and given guidelines. One of the guidelines that we were given was that anytime we saw a photo, a statue, or any semblance of the Kim dynasty, anyone in the Kim dynasty, we had to bow, and it had to be a deep bow in front of the statue or the photograph, and we were never to take a photograph that did not include the entire figure, which was interesting.
Oh, interesting.
And in going to, after we had a chance to see the subway, we went to see the 72-foot statues of Kim Il-sung and his son, the first two of the Kim dynasty. The bronze statues are 72 feet tall, and it is a place where people come to celebrate occasions. There were a number of brides there with their bridal party, and they come to those statues and that memorial, and they bring flowers, and they bow down to the statues, and they deliver their flowers. So it is maybe required that if you have a big celebration, you will come and honor the dynasty and present flowers.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Really a deity, a godhead of the country, if you will.
It is, and we visited the Science Museum, we visited the library. There were no people in the buildings when we were there. When we were in the library, there were no books on the shelves. You had to go to a desk and request a book, and then through a pneumatic system, a book would appear at the desk and you would be given the book. So the library was very closed for, you don't go in and read in their library.
Interesting. You know, I think running is hard enough, let alone running with the weight of all of the research that you carried out. You know, it's a lot to walk into another country and participate in a race, in a sporting event, with that burden of knowledge. Moving into the race, tell me about the logistics day of.
The day of the race, we all met for breakfast, and then we were taken to the stadium, which is quite an amazing stadium. It seats 150,000 people, 150,000 spectators. And the stadium was probably, I would guess of 150,000, about 100,000 people were there. There were 6 bands scattered throughout the stadium, and the music was different. Each band had a different music, so we had the music going, and we went through the tunnel to go onto the field, and the runners walked around the field, and then we had the gun for the start. The stadium with the 150,000 is the largest sporting event stadium in the world. It was built It was built when Seoul, Korea was told that they were going to have the Olympics, and they built their Olympic stadium. And at the same time they were building the stadium for the Seoul Olympics, they built the stadium in North Korea with 150,000 seats to be larger than the one in Seoul, Korea.
That's great. Hey, and you know, it was put to good use for this marathon. That's fantastic. So for the 1,500 runners, you've got the staff of chaperones.
Yes.
What did the marathon staff look like, and what did the security look like? I'm sure there was intense security throughout the whole marathon.
There was intense security. There were spectators along the route, and just like the spectators in the stadium, they were told to be there. And along the entire route, the guards were probably maybe 50 to 100 feet apart. And
Route.
all out, the entire route. And we did have water stations, and we did have toilet stations, and it was interesting to watch the people, because the people didn't understand a high five. And so at first, I think some of the first runners were showing, were doing the high five. And so then as the later runners came along, they wanted to high five. But it was just interesting to see their response. It was no more than a high five, but they were supportive. Even though they were required to be there, they were very supportive spectators.
That's great. Yeah, it's I suppose, a pleasant duty to perform.
It was interesting when we toured the route for the run, there were some construction sites, and they told us when we passed the construction sites, under no circumstances could we take photographs of construction sites. The year I was there in 2016 was the first year they allowed cameras and GoPros on the course.
You've preempted my next question.
Oh,
yeah.
And they told us that we were prepped with that. You do not take construction photos. And at those sites, the guards were almost completely surrounding the sites, shoulder to shoulder.
Now, did you see many runners with GoPros?
Oh, yes, yes. And it was interesting because after the race, when I went online, they had all kinds of. These are how the people travel. They had blogs up already from their GoPros.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I can imagine, being one of the first events where you can really take great footage. It would be an attractive event to those influencers and bloggers and runners of all category.
Yes.
So which category were you in? I know you mentioned you were in.
I was over 70, and I was the only woman over 70.
Oh wow, oh, that's great. Yeah, first place in your category. Yeah. Oh, that's great. So what was your time, and let's start with that. What was your time?
I just beat 4 hours.
Oh, that's great. Wow.
Which meant I didn't have to be picked up.
So you were serious. At 4 hours, they came and they took
4.5.
4.5. They collected you. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And there were a lot of people presumably being collected and brought back to the finish line.
Yeah, you weren't out there after they cleared the route.
Interesting. So it wasn't a friendly marathon then. They're not handing out ribbons to the guy who came in 8 hours.
They didn't have a division for over 70.
That's great. So my next question, and we sort of touched on this earlier. There's a facade that you talked about.
Yes.
Just for the whole country, let alone the guides. There's an image that's being portrayed. Were there any moments of earnestness, of I guess, real human connection with any of the spectators or the guides or anyone you really came into contact with? Real human moments of connection?
I cannot think of one. Cannot think of one.
Yeah, I really want to let that sink in. That's incredible that you were there for as long as you were, and that the mask stayed on that long. And
you know, we think about having dinner together tonight and how we all shared our experiences, and how that's life. Living life and sharing experiences. They don't have that. Maybe they do in their own communities, but not with outsiders.
Interesting.
And that's, to me, that's part of travel. Being somewhere and getting to know the people and getting to know the culture. And I did not leave North Korea with that feeling of knowing the people and knowing the culture.
Well, and I suppose that's by design.
Absolutely.
I suppose that's by design, and it's as much as them not wanting travelers and explorers to take away true aspects of the culture as much as it is bringing different aspects of different cultures. So it's very interesting.
And I don't think they wanted I don't think they wanted their people to hear anything from, I don't think they wanted their people to be sharing information with us or for us to share information with them. I think maybe that was the biggest obstacle that they, that they anticipated, that we would come and maybe have conversation with their people, and they did not want that. And so their people were aware that they were not to have conversation and an open relationship with the guests who were there.
Very arm's distance. That's interesting.
Very, yes.
Were they willing to translate signs and some of the murals and the slogans and the things that you saw if you asked?
The guides spoke very good English, and so they would describe the murals and what they meant, and it was the propaganda of what the people are designated to do in one of the 3 areas of work, and that was it, along with the supreme leader of the Kims.
Interesting. And aside from the photos, were there any opportunities to buy souvenirs and bring them back? Were there any opportunities for you to, and I'm assuming not, but I have to ask.
There were opportunities, but we could tell they were totally set up before we arrived. They had these stamp shops. We could go in and buy a stamp, like a postage stamp.
Oh, interesting.
From North Korea. There was another place that was selling some kind of alcohol with a snake in the bottle. And some of their bottled liquors, but they were sort of not professionally done. They were just sort of like homemade glasses, you know, that they filled with some kind of liquid and a snake or whatever. Those are really the only 2 places I can remember that we visited for stamps, and then for the liquor. That was we didn't go to department stores, dress shops, or any other stores, grocery stores. I would have liked to have seen a grocery store, but we didn't go to a grocery store.
Interesting. And presumably it's all very, very curated. So it makes me wonder why those were the things that were presented to the tourists. Moving more broadly into travel and to marathons, I'm assuming this wasn't your first marathon. You alluded to a different one. It would be incredible if it was. Talking about your marathon, travels and life, and your training method and your preparation and all that kind of good stuff.
I've been running marathons now for 53 years.
Whoa. Wow.
And I am so blessed that I have not had injuries. I run In training for a marathon, I would typically run 6 days a week. I would run daily about 6 or 7 miles, and then on the weekend I'd do a run that would be maybe 12, 15 miles. That was the most I would run before a marathon. And I never ran for time. I never ran for time. I ran just because I love to run. And it was my private, my special time. It was just really my time to have to myself and to get some exercise, and I ran because I enjoyed it. I didn't run planning to compete, and I feel very fortunate that I have been able to become a competitive runner and win a number of races in my age division, and to continue to run today. I mean, last weekend, to do a half marathon. I just feel truly blessed that I can do that. My diet is not that strict. I enjoy all types of food. I'll have to admit my favorite meal is nachos and a margarita with a little...
Who doesn't like nachos and a margarita?
With a little Don Julio 42 on the top. So you can see, I mean, I'm not that strict with my diet, but it's just... I don't know if it's maybe genetics or mental. I think it's probably a combination, but I've just been blessed to still be running at my age.
That's fantastic. I love to hear that. That's incredible.
Thank you.
So aside from running all these marathons, you also travel quite a bit. And actually, so before the travel conversation, for your 70th birthday, you snuck away.
I did.
And went skydiving.
I did that.
Tell me about that. Tell me about your skydiving.
Well, that was another thing I wanted to do to commemorate my birthday, and I decided that it would be really a kick to skydive. And I didn't tell my children or my grandchildren or my husband. And the night before I was supposed to do it, I thought, tomorrow I could die. And so I better share this with someone. So I told my husband, I said, I am going to go skydiving tomorrow. It was tandem skydiving. I'm going to go skydiving tomorrow. And he said, you're doing what? And I said, skydiving. You're not going to do that. That's not a smart thing for you to do. And I said, well, I'm all signed up, and it's really something that I want to do. I convinced him, and he let me. Well, he didn't let me. I convinced him I was going to do it. And so he went with me. Wow. And he filmed it, and I did the skydive, and it was absolutely amazing. And was I terrified? Yes. When my tandem said, okay, let's go. And it was our turn at the door. We were up about 13,000 feet, and he said, you want to do a backflip when we go out? And I said, why not? So we did the backflip and went down, and it was just, the free fall was just, I mean, it really was kind of terrifying. But then when the chute opened, and, you know, we're just cruising down with the chute and seeing 360 degrees from the ocean to the mountains in San Diego, it was just absolutely beautiful, and an experience that I'll never forget. It was great.
I can imagine. Between that and the nachos and the margarita, what a great way to celebrate your birthday. What a great way to celebrate your birthday. Now, I'm looking at a long list of places that you've traveled. And I'd love to pick out a few and just discuss some highlights from it. Where would you like to start? What was some of your more notable trips that just stood out to you for whatever reason?
Well, my most recent trip was last September, and 3 friends and I went to South Africa. I'd always wanted to go to South Africa. I'd always wanted to see, I wanted to go to the wine country, I wanted to go to Victoria Falls, I wanted to do safari in Botswana, and so we did that. We went to Cape Town, we did the wine country, which was wonderful. I had no idea that it was so beautiful, and that the wines were so delicious in South Africa, wonderful wines. And then we went on to Zimbabwe and went to Victoria Falls. And we were standing on the Zimbabwe side, looking across the falls to Zambia. And because I'm in the Traveler Century Club, and we like to acquire countries, but not just to go across the border and say, you know, I have a stamp and I've been there. I wanted to go to Zambia and have an experience in Zambia. So as we stood there and looked across from Zimbabwe, we saw people in an area of rocks that were sort of right at the edge of the falls. And the guide, we said, what are they doing? And he said, well, they call that the Devil's Pool. And you hang over the falls from Devil's Pool. And we said, well, how do we go to Zambia? And he said, well, you get a guide for the day, and you go to the hotel here in Zimbabwe and get a ticket for the day to do the Devil's Pool and then to have tea afterwards. And so we did that. We got our ticket to do that, and then we had a one-day visa for Zambia, and we crossed over and we went into Zambia and went to the area where they had the queue in for the Devil's Pool in Victoria Falls. There were signs there as we approached the area that said, you are doing this at your own risk, even to the point of death. And so we started maneuvering our way across these very slippery rocks in about waist-high water. And I'm thinking, I'm going to break my ankle. I mean, because it was really slippery and it was really rocky. And so we worked our way through the rocks, and then we're into water that's over our head and a very strong current. We had 2 guides. And so one guide was with me where it was over my head, and the other guide was in front of me, probably about, I'd say probably about 50 feet. And so the first guide said, okay, now get in the current and go with the current to the guide. So I got in the current, swam to the second guide, and then the second guide helped me get over to the rocks to get into the Devil's Pool. Well, the Devil's Pool is right at the edge of the falls. And so I go over to the rock that's to sit on before I approach the edge. And one of the guides takes my ankles and holds my ankles, and I'm hanging over the falls. So I'm hanging over the falls with this guide. I had no idea how competent he is or if he even would let me go. Sure, yeah. So I'm hanging over the falls. He's holding on to my ankles, and we got a picture.
And there it is. Look at that.
There it is.
Incredible. Well, so I have to ask, I think this is on everybody's mind, what kind of tea did you drink afterward?
They called it tea.
Okay.
I suppose because of the influence from the British, and the tea was actually white wine and cheese and crackers.
Well,
that was our tea.
I suppose you would need it after looking down that waterfall and wondering if you're going to be let go.
That's what they classified as a tea.
Hey, it's my kind of tea.
Yeah,
that's
my
fantastic.
kind of tea.
So beyond South Africa, hanging over waterfalls, running marathons in South Korea, you're also a scuba diver.
Yes.
So all of the extremes. I love it. I noticed you dove Truk Lagoon.
I did dive the Truk Lagoon.
So
yes.
I don't know if you know, we had a speaker discuss the Truk Lagoon a couple of weeks ago, and I'd love to put you in contact with them. You can discuss your experience there. But what were some highlights there for you?
Well, for me, the highlights were that I had just been certified on Saturday, and a week later I was scuba diving in the Truck Lagoon. And I am not certified for wreck diving. I just had a general scuba certification. And so when we started our diving in the Truck Lagoon, I said, I'm not going to go in the wrecks. Next thing I know, I'm down 100 feet in a freighter, and I'm going, you said you'd never do this. And there I was. I just followed the guide and had a very good dive guide. And so he led us through the freighters and through the airplane wreckages, and I did it.
That's fantastic. Now, the last speaker that discussed Truck Lagoon mentioned the degradation of the site. You know, the ship falling apart just because of the elements.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Did you see
Yes.
a lot of that? And what was it like when you were there? What was the status of the wrecks?
The wrecks definitely were broken up, and of course all of the bodies had been removed, but there were things left behind, like some of the pottery pieces, like the wine jugs and the plates and things like that. So there still were some pieces that were there from the original ships and equipment from the airplanes, but it was for me it was definitely something that I would recommend for someone of my ability with a dive guide, because it's easy to get confused in those kind of diving situations where you really don't know if you're up or down when you're going in freighters and planes and things like that. So I had the confidence of my guide that I would be safe.
Yeah, as a new diver, entering those really confined spaces at odd angles and seeing things that you're used to seeing kind of in a very upright, correctly oriented position, to then swimming through and seeing things all over the place. It was, I'm sure, very disorienting. So props to your guide for getting you through that and guiding you through that trip. Gosh, I normally don't do interviews with notes. And I'm so glad I have these notes for you, because you just have such a fantastic wealth of travel. I'd like to discuss one more of your trips, anyone that you feel you'd like to touch on, and then I'd like to open it up to questions, because we've got a great audience who I'm sure would love to ask you some questions. So any other specific trips that really speak to you and you'd like to touch on?
I'd like to share with you that when I retired in 2000, my husband and I decided that we would lease our home out and that we would travel for 8 months with no itinerary. The only thing we had was an open ticket for London, round trip, airline ticket. And so we took off and traveled for those 8 months. We leased a car in Amsterdam and turned it in Spain. And after 90 days, we were on ferries, we were on dirt roads, our adventures were just amazing. And during our trip, my husband had to come back to the States because his sister was not well. And so he said, would you like to travel on your own, or do you want to come back with me? And I said, I'd like to travel on my own, if that's okay. And he said, yes. And so I stayed, and I traveled on my own independently for about 6 weeks during the 8-month time. And my first, we were in Cyprus when he flew back to the States, and we were in southern Cyprus. And as you know, there is a great animosity between southern Cyprus and northern Cyprus. And I wanted to get to northern Cyprus. No one in southern Cyprus would tell me how to get to northern Cyprus because they hate each other. You know, there's a hatred there between the two countries, and the Turks and the Greeks. And I would say, how do I get there? And no one knew how to get there or how to get to the border. Well, I met a woman at the bus stop from Switzerland, and she was going to the Capitol, and she said, the border is near the Capitol, and you can get to the border if you take the bus with me to the Capitol. I went with her to the Capitol, and then the border was probably maybe a half a mile away. And so I approached the border, I thought, and all of a sudden these guards came out in camouflage and said, what are you doing here? And this is a demilitarization zone and you can't be here. I said, I'm trying to get to the border of northern Cyprus. And they said, well, if that's where you're going, you need to go one more road over and to get to the border. So I got through the border of northern Cyprus and spent the day in northern Cyprus, which was really pretty sad because it had been so bombed out that the churches were being used for the cattle, for barns, if you will. And the area was just devastated there at the border. And then I had to be back across the border by 7 o'clock that night. And when I was returning on the bus, the woman from Switzerland said, I'm staying at the home of the lead of the Southern Cyprus head of archaeology. He's having a big party tonight, and maybe you can come. I will call you at the hotel. Well, he came and picked me up for the party. I went to the party, and the next day he took us with his keys to all of these different archaeological digs.
Wow.
I mean, it was just one of those times that was just like, is this real? You know, that I had that series of events that landed me at that party and with those opportunities. So that was an amazing experience. And from there I went on to Tel Aviv and stayed in a hostel in Tel Aviv because I was on my own. And took the bus through the Gaza Strip to Cairo.
Wow.
And that was a little bit unsettling. I didn't realize the danger of the Gaza Strip. And staying in the hostel, I said to the kids there, because they were all kids except me, how do you get to Cairo? And they said, oh, you take the 5 o'clock bus. You get your visa, you take the 5 o'clock bus in the morning and go through the Gaza Strip and go to Cairo. I said, okay. So I got my bus ticket, and then all of a sudden I find myself in the Gaza Strip and realized it did not look like a safe place to be. There were 6 buses, and they waited until we were all in line to cross into the border. And we had military convoys in front of the buses and behind the buses, leading us into Egypt. So that was another a little bit unsettling situation in the Gaza Strip.
I can imagine. Yeah, you see, when you're traveling, you see all sides of humanity, I suppose, from the kind stranger who shows you some interesting facets of the place you are to military escorts through places that may not be the safest to travel through. So yeah. Very interesting and very inspirational. I'm so glad we could have this conversation today.
I am too.
And because I know I'm not the only one with questions, I'd love to open it up to audience questions. Lance will walk with the mic, and please, if you have a question, raise your hand. Yes, Michael, in front.
I'm going to start. How long were you in North Korea? How many days?
I was there for 5 days.
Okay, thank you.
Great talk. Thank you very much, Dame Gloria. So, did you get to have a companion, or your husband, or anybody in your immediate family or friend, or a +1 when you got to go to North Korea, or was the limited to just the runners, those who entered the marathon?
Yes, my husband was with me on that trip.
So you don't have to be a runner to get the visa.
Exactly. You exactly right. Yes, you could go as someone accompanying the runner.
Great conversation. Thank you. I was curious, while you were in North Korea, how were you, or were you communicating with anyone outside? I imagine you didn't have cell service or anything like that.
She can't talk about the secret messages she was sending back.
You know, I'm just thinking about, I did not have a cell phone with me. Yes, they did allow cell phones in because other people did. I didn't take a cell phone with me, but other people did have cell phones, yes. And so I'm sorry, I don't know what the reception was for cell phones.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's for any non-runners in the audience tonight, I want to put into context that a 4-hour marathon is incredibly impressive for any age group, any gender. To do it on your 70th birthday in North Korea, which is a tough race, is beyond impressive, so thank you. Congratulations. My question is, you went into North Korea with doing a lot of research about the conditions there and what led to current day. When you left, were you generally hopeful for the country? Were you discouraged? What was your feeling upon leaving?
I was so discouraged. I was so discouraged for the people who are so controlled and brainwashed. They worship these leaders. It's just amazing how they have become so dedicated to the leaders and non-challenging. They accept it. And like I mentioned, those who may wish to escape, they know the consequences. And that's difficult. That makes trying to escape very difficult.
I think you mentioned that you went in 2016, which would have been before the UVA student, correct? Is that right?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Oh, was this, you went in 2016 before the UVA student was detained and then brought back, Otto?
Yes.
So, because I think, right, like as of now, or at least the last time I looked into it, you're no longer able to obtain a visa, I think, since that incident. Like, do you see a path forward in the future for people being able to do this experience, or do you think that ship has sailed?
I think going forward, they're going to maintain what they have currently in that country. And I think that now they still have the event, but it is not open to U.S. runners and runners from South Korea. So that was the window to go when I did. And we have, I think Jay was there in 2017, and he had an opportunity to be there for the run.
Thank you for sharing your amazing story and your amazing runs. In the written description of your talk tonight, it was mentioned that you were instructed that you could only photograph the ruling class in North Korea if you took a whole body photograph. And I wondered why that was, if that was explained.
I don't know. I don't know. That was just one of the guidelines they gave us. And you have to ask, if you're taking a photograph, how do they know that you're not editing, or how do they know that you're not changing what's on the phone or on the camera or whatever? But it was just a guideline they gave us at the beginning when we went through all of the guidelines for the visit.
Just kind of seems odd or arbitrary.
I think so.
I have another question for you. When you were at the Devil's Pool, two things. There was a guide 50 feet ahead of you had to swim down to. So how did you get back? That's what I was curious, because you went down to the current. How did you get back? And were there any stories of people actually going over the falls?
Well, Lance, after we hung over the falls, we had to go back the same way we came.
You had to swim upstream against the current to get out of there.
Yeah, but actually when we were going upstream, they did put up a rope. So we could hold on to a rope when we were going against the current, and then onto the rocks. And then with the rope, we got onto the rocks.
Okay. And I'm just curious, was there any, because they've got all the signs up and we saw the photo and the cliff. I mean, that's a little bit of a precarious situation. Is there any situation where somebody went, oops, I went to scratch my nose and the guest is gone, you know?
Not that that country would ever admit.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one question.
We got Rich over here.
Two questions. First of all, how many international marathons have you run?
So I'll build off of that. How many marathons have you run in total?
I've run over 100 marathons.
Congratulations, that's well. And how many roughly international?
I ran in Venezuela, in Caracas, and that's the only other one. That's why I wanted to do an international one for my birthday, another international run.
And the second question is, how many countries on the Traveler Century Club have you been to?
I am, as he mentioned, I'm a member of the Traveler Century Club, and for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it is a club for travelers who have been to 100 countries. It was established in the early 1950s, so you can imagine at that time with just the prop planes, it was difficult to get to 100 countries. We have a different way of counting our countries in the Travelers Club.
I know.
We count countries and territories.
And destinations.
And so, for example, if you look at the United Nations list of countries, I think that's in the 190 something. But in the Traveler Century Club, we have about 327 countries that we count, countries and territories that we count as a location to visit and use in our count. And at this time, I have about 210 countries that I have visited.
Oh my gosh, I'm at 206 and I'm going to be at 211 in 5 months. So I'll be right
And you're
up
going to
there
be
with
one
you.
ahead of me. You'll be one ahead of me. Good for you.
Oh, we got one more question right here in the front.
But Rich, she's ahead of you now, okay? She's ahead of you now. I think that's it.
We have one more question right here.
Okay.
Hi, you mentioned that you flew from Beijing over to Pyongyang, and I'm just curious, I'm assuming it was on Air Koryo. I'm just curious as to what that flight was like.
That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it, because about 2 months before I flew from Beijing to Pyongyang, they purchased an airplane from Russia. And at that time, well, before they purchased that plane, North Korea Airlines was known to be the worst airlines and the most dangerous airlines in the world. Fortunately, this plane was purchased 2 months before my trip, and so the plane was very safe and very modern, and I felt safe on the plane. It was interesting, as soon as we sat down in our seats, they started the video in front of our seat with the propaganda, with the North Korean music and the speeches from Kim, and for the entire trip we had propaganda from North Korea on the plane.
Wow.
I didn't understand it, of course, but it was there.
Well, it's in there somewhere. Gloria, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Please, round of applause for the real McCoy.